Behind layers of concrete, razor wire, and armed watchtowers lie the stories of men whose crimes shook the nation. Some wait in silence. Others make headlines from their cells. All of them sit on death row, counting the days. Who are they? What did they do? And how did they get here? Here's a chilling look at some of the most dangerous prisoners awaiting execution in the United States. Dylan Storm Roof. He walked into the church that evening not as a stranger looking for shelter, but as a man carrying a loaded purpose, masked behind a calm expression and a bowl haircut that would become tragically recognizable. Dylan Storm Roof was only 21 years old when he stepped into the historic Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, during a quiet Wednesday on June 17, 2015. He sat through nearly an hour of Bible study beside the very people he came to murder, waiting with the stillness of someone who already knew exactly what came next. What he did in the moments that followed would sear his name into the darkest pages of American history. 9 people were killed that night, 9 black worshipers, including the church's senior pastor and state senator, Clementa C. Pinckney. A 10th was left injured, and the sanctity of that church was shattered by bullets, fired not in panic, but in hate. It wasn't a crime of impulse or desperation. It was a mission carried out with chilling clarity. When the news broke and faces began to be identified, Roof was quickly named the suspect. By the next morning, he was in custody in Shelby, North Carolina. There was no dramatic standoff, no fight to deny it. He confessed with ease, telling investigators he had done it to start a race war. That confession peeled back the curtain on a twisted ideology that had been building quietly inside him for years. Just 3 days after the massacre, a website surfaced, The Last Rhodesian, confirming what many feared. This wasn't random. This was planned. The site featured photos of Roof draped in the iconography of white supremacy, posing with the Confederate flag, brandishing weapons and surrounded by the banners of apartheid-era Africa and Nazi Germany. But the most haunting element was the manifesto. In it, he laid out his beliefs with the tone of someone who thought he'd uncovered a truth the world was too blind to see. He wrote about black people with venom. He praised segregation. He blamed the death of Trayvon Martin and the portrayal of black-on-white crime for opening his eyes to what he saw as a racial awakening. It was all there, written out like the warped gospel of someone who saw himself as a soldier in a self-declared war. On December 15, 2016, justice began its slow grind. In federal court, he was found guilty on all 33 charges, including hate crimes. And less than a month later, on January 11, 2017, he was sentenced to death, the first person in U.S. history to receive the federal death penalty for a hate crime. But the courtroom saga didn't end there. On March 31, 2017, Roof made another move, this time in South Carolina State Court, agreeing to plead guilty to 9 counts of murder, 3 of attempted murder, and a weapons charge, all to avoid facing a second death sentence. He received 9 life sentences to be served without parole. And now, years after the massacre, Dylan Roof waits inside the concrete walls of USP Terre Haute, the federal penitentiary where executions are carried out. He is the youngest person on federal death row in the United States, and every day he waits under the weight of a sentence that mirrors the gravity of what he took away. A sentence that, unlike the lives of his victims, has an end date yet to come. Robert Bowers. The morning of October 27, 2018, began like any other Saturday at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where 3 congregations, Tree of Life, New Light, and Dor Hadash, had gathered for Shabbat services in different parts of the building. Some were already deep in prayer, others preparing for Torah study, the sacred rituals unfolding in their usual quiet rhythm. But that rhythm was shattered at 9:50 a.m. when a man stepped through the front doors with an arsenal built for destruction and a mind driven by hate. Robert Bowers, described as a bearded, heavy-set white male, entered the synagogue armed with a Colt AR-15, semi-automatic rifle, and semi-automatic pistols. He wasn't guessing or flailing. He was executing. He fired each weapon with brutal precision. Inside the building, the confusion was instant and devastating. The first to fall were two brothers, Cecil and David Rosenthal, gunned down near the main entrance before Bowers moved toward the basement. Some congregants upstairs mistook the noise for something innocuous, a fallen coat rack maybe, but reality arrived fast and merciless. In the basement, Melvin Wax, who had been leading New Light service, tried to hide in a pitch-black closet. When he cracked the door open, Bowers shot him dead on sight. He didn't see the others still huddled in the dark corner of that same closet. Elsewhere in the basement kitchen, Bowers found and murdered two more members of New Light, Richard Gottfried and Daniel Stein. He didn't pause. He didn't falter. His rampage continued as he moved through the synagogue, hunting people not at random, but with a horrifying clarity of intent. Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz, a member of Dor Hadash, heard the shots and ran toward them, trying to help whoever had been hurt. Bowers shot and killed him too. Upstairs in the Tree of Life sanctuary, 13 worshipers were gathered for the Shabbat service. Rabbi Jeffrey Myers managed to guide 4 of them to safety through a side door. The others weren't so lucky. Bowers shot 8 of them, killing 7 and wounding 1. His attack wasn't only physical, it was ideological. According to police sources, he screamed, "All Jews must die," during the assault. This wasn't chaos. It was a deliberate act of anti-Semitic terrorism fueled by conspiracy and hate. As police arrived at 9:59, Bowers turned his fire on them. Bullets met bullets at the synagogue's entrance, forcing him back inside. He shot and wounded 2 officers and 2 SWAT members, one of them critically. Even then, he kept fighting. He fired at the tactical team when they breached the building and only stopped when they struck him multiple times. Bleeding, Bowers crawled to a 3rd-floor room and hid. At 11 o'clock and 8 a.m., he surrendered, wounded but still unrepentant. In custody, as officers treated his injuries, he reportedly told a SWAT officer that he wanted Jews to die and believed they were committing genocide against his people. Robert Bowers discharged his weapon 67 times in that synagogue. Every shot fueled by years of radicalized hate, every bullet aimed at people gathered to pray. The massacre he carried out remains the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in American history. On August 3, 2023, Bowers was formally sentenced to death. His heinous crime showed the world just how terrifying hatred becomes when it's armed, angry, and convinced it's righteous. David Joseph Carpenter. David Joseph Carpenter's story didn't begin on the trails, but it was always heading there. Long before he became known as the Trailside Killer, his actions had already crossed deeply troubling lines. At the age of 15, he began preying on other children, his own cousins among them, and by 17, he was arrested for assaulting a 3-year-old child. His behavior led to time in the custody of the California Youth Authority, followed by years spent inside Napa State Hospital. But those years behind closed doors didn't stop what was already growing inside him. As soon as he re-entered the world, he was back under suspicion, this time for attacking a 17-year-old girl. And though he managed to walk free from that courtroom, he carried with him a darkness that had only just begun to take shape. That darkness would later consume the serene landscapes of Northern California. Between 1979 and 1981, Carpenter began haunting the trails and state parks around the San Francisco Bay Area. He wasn't looking for attention. He was looking for isolation, paths where he could stalk, control, and kill without interruption. He carried a .38 caliber handgun and used it in nearly every attack. His method was deliberate, his presence silent until it was far too late. He didn't choose random places. He chose nature's quiet corners, where the sound of wind through trees could cover a gunshot, and where cries for help could vanish before reaching anyone who might hear. As the bodies began to appear, fear tightened its grip on every trail. The forested parks, once places of calm retreat, took on a different shape. The sunlight on the path no longer offered comfort. Every crunch of gravel, every shadow between trees, every moment of solitude now came with a question unspoken. Is someone watching? Carpenter had turned freedom into a trap, and he moved through the wilderness with a familiarity that made him all the more terrifying. By the time investigators finally put a name to the horror that had stalked the trails of Northern California, the damage was staggering. 2 women had been found murdered in the wooded edges of Santa Cruz County, their final moments hidden beneath redwoods and silence. 4 more years passed, and with them came the weight of 5 more names, 5 more lives taken in Marin County under nearly identical calculated circumstances. Each one had been alone. Each one had trusted the peaceful surroundings. Each one had no idea someone was watching. Then came the 8th. A body found in San Francisco, once detached from the rest, was finally pulled into the circle through DNA. A match that confirmed what had already become clear. Carpenter hadn't just haunted one region or one summer. His reach had spread across counties, across years, across the fragile illusion of safety. And yet, even as time moved on, one thing remained. Carpenter is still here. At 94 years old, he has lived decades past the trails he once turned into hunting grounds, waiting for the death that he was sentenced to. As of 2025, Carpenter is incarcerated in the California Health Care Facility, being a living reminder of the horrors he once committed. Brian Gene Nichols. Brian Gene Nichols' violent path toward freedom began on March 11, 2005, inside the Fulton County Courthouse, a place meant for justice. Nichols, already a convicted felon, found himself standing before the court for yet another trial. But this day would take an unexpected turn, one that would set off a chain of bloodshed and terror. Overpowering Sheriff Deputy Cynthia Hall while she was changing clothes, Nichols seized her Glock service pistol and left her in a coma. This brutal act marked the beginning of his calculated escape. In a chilling move, Nichols had already prepared for this moment by hiding shanks in his shoes, planning for a heinous escape. But Nichols took control of the situation, heading into the courtroom where he fatally shot Judge Barnes and court reporter Julie Ann Brandau. His cold violence didn't stop there. As he fled the courthouse, he murdered Sergeant Hoyt Teasley. The escape didn't end when Nichols left the courthouse. He stole vehicles, evaded capture, and became the subject of a nationwide manhunt, even appearing on America's Most Wanted. With the law breathing down his neck, Nichols was anything but finished. He attempted to kidnap a young woman later that day, but her boyfriend intervened, and Nichols fled. But his desperation escalated quickly. He shot and killed ICE Special Agent David G. Wilhelm, stealing the agent's badge, firearm, and pickup truck in the process. The manhunt was relentless, but Nichols would finally meet his end. After a 911 call from Ashley Smith, a woman who had unknowingly become part of his twisted story, Nichols was cornered. Smith had been held hostage by Nichols at gunpoint for 7 hours in her Duluth apartment. In an unexpected twist, Smith's calm presence, paired with a copy of The Purpose-Driven Life, played a pivotal role in his surrender. She even made him pancakes for breakfast before convincing him to let her leave and contact the authorities. Nichols, exhausted and worn down by his own actions, gave himself up, and the stolen truck was found nearby. The man who had brought terror to so many lives was finally in custody. Nichols was transported to a Federal Bureau of Investigation field office, where he confessed to the atrocities he'd committed during his escape. In the face of it all, he would be charged with 54 separate crimes. When the trial came to a close in 2008, the verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. Nichols was sentenced to life in prison, a life that would now be spent behind bars for the carnage he had caused. Albert Greenwood Brown. Albert Greenwood Brown Jr. is a name that carries the weight of chilling violence and unrelenting danger. Born in 1954, his criminal behavior started early, but it would only escalate with time, reaching horrifying peaks. In his youth, he was charged with molesting an 11-year-old girl, a crime that set the tone for the horrors that would follow. Instead of being rehabilitated, his time in prison seemed to fuel his darker inclinations. Released from prison in 1980, he wasted no time returning to his violent ways. Brown's brutality reached new depths when he abducted 15-year-old Susan Louise Jordan on her way to school. He dragged her into a secluded orange grove, where he unleashed a savage attack, choking her with her shoelace until she was dead. The horror didn't stop there. After taking her life, he made a phone call to her mother, callously taunting her with the words that would haunt her forever. "You will never see your daughter again," he said. Brown then directed authorities to her body as if it were some twisted game. Brown was arrested and convicted for Susan's murder, which led to his death sentence. In 2010, he was scheduled for execution by lethal injection, but legal challenges and delays, including issues with the lethal injection drug, postponed the process. As of 2025, Brown remains on death row in California, awaiting the resolution of his case, amidst the ongoing suspension of the death penalty in the state. Stephen Catlin. Stephen Catlin's life unfolded with a disturbingly consistent pattern: death, insurance money, and a trail of suspicions that grew as his actions became increasingly sinister. In April 1976, his wife, Joyce Catlin, was admitted to Mercy Hospital in Bakersfield, showing symptoms of what was diagnosed as a severe flu. Though she seemed to improve initially, her health deteriorated rapidly, and she died a month later from what was determined to be pneumonia. As was typical in his life, the details of Joyce's death remained clouded in ambiguity, and a body was swiftly cremated under Catlin's orders. Less than a month after Joyce's death, Catlin married his fifth wife, Glenna Kay, and moved to Fresno, where he quickly climbed the ranks of his new job at a local garage. His ambition was evident, but so was his insatiable thirst for a lavish lifestyle. With his finances always strained, Catlin's need for money became a constant undercurrent to his actions. When his adoptive father died in 1980, his passing was attributed to cancer, but as with the others, Catlin took charge of the arrangements, opting to have the body cremated immediately. The years following continued in a similar vein. A year later, as the financial pressure mounted and auto parts began going missing from the garage where he worked, a background check revealed his criminal history, forcing him to leave his job without facing any charges. Then, in February 1984, Glenna fell mysteriously ill while on a trip to Las Vegas with her mother. After her sudden hospitalization for fluid in her lungs, doctors were unable to determine her illness before she died on March 14th. By that point, Catlin had already received a substantial life insurance payout of $57,000. Yet, this wasn't the end. Back in Bakersfield, Catlin's third ex-wife, noticing the pattern of deaths around him, approached the local sheriff with her suspicions. In 1984, after an investigation, it was revealed that Joyce Catlin had been cremated, but tissue samples taken from her body had been preserved by the hospital. Upon testing, they confirmed the presence of poisoning from paraquat, a deadly herbicide. Suspiciously, a bottle of the same herbicide with Catlin's fingerprints on it was found in his garage. By the time investigators pieced together the full scope of his actions, Catlin's mother, Martha, had died of a sudden stroke in December 1985, shortly after visiting with her son and his new fiancée. Once again, Catlin ordered immediate cremation, but this time authorities moved quickly enough to perform an autopsy before the body was incinerated. The revelations came swiftly after that. Paraquat poisoning had killed not just Joyce and Martha Catlin, but also Glenna Kay, his fifth wife. Catlin was charged with the murder of Joyce, his fourth wife, and Martha, his mother. His final wife would come shortly after, marrying him even as his dark history closed in. In 1986, Catlin was convicted for the murder of Glenna Kay Catlin, with the jury sentencing him to life imprisonment without parole. The truth of his other killings would not come to light until later, when a jury in 1990 convicted him of the murders of Joyce and Martha Catlin, with aggravating circumstances, including financial gain and poisoning. His sentence: death by lethal injection. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, a name forever linked to one of the most harrowing acts of domestic terrorism in modern history, was the younger brother who stood beside Tamerlan Tsarnaev in the shadows of destruction. Born on July 22, 1993, in the quiet surroundings of Kyrgyzstan, Dzhokhar would eventually be granted derivative asylum status in the U.S. upon his parents' plea to the government after the fall of the Soviet Union. April 15, 2013, began like any other day for thousands of runners and spectators at the Boston Marathon. But for Dzhokhar and his older brother Tamerlan, it was the day they would bring their deadly vision to life. The Tsarnaev brothers, driven by an extreme and twisted ideology, planted 2 pressure cooker bombs near the marathon's finish line. As the clock ticked toward the finish, 2 explosions rocked the heart of Boston, sending shockwaves through the crowd. 3 innocent lives were lost, and 264 others were left shattered by the blast. The brothers had set out to create chaos and instill fear, and they succeeded, leaving a city in disbelief and a nation on edge. What followed was a manhunt of unprecedented scale. Authorities had little to go on until the FBI released photos of the brothers. The country was plunged into a fever pitch of uncertainty as the Tsarnaevs were now labeled public enemies. But the horror wasn't over. In a violent, cold-blooded act of defiance, the brothers killed MIT police officer Sean Collier just hours after being identified. They didn't hesitate. The officer, who had no chance to defend himself, was executed in the same ruthless manner they had carried out their bombings. The Tsarnaevs' brutality only escalated as they embarked on a deadly shootout with police, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. Tamerlan, the older brother, would soon die from his injuries in a hail of gunfire, but Dzhokhar, the younger, seemingly more naive brother, was still on the run. A city gripped by fear was transformed into a war zone as thousands of police officers scoured every inch of Watertown, Massachusetts. The manhunt stretched into the night, and just as hope seemed to wane, Dzhokhar was found, hiding in the confines of a boat in someone's backyard. Captured and brought to the hospital in critical condition, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's chilling words would haunt those who heard them. He and his brother had planned even more destruction, including a second wave of bombings in New York City's Times Square. Dzhokhar's actions were cold and calculated, driven by an unyielding desire to create terror. He was no longer just a student or a son. He had become a symbol of terror, a figure whose very name sparked dread. Despite his apparent youth, Dzhokhar had carried out a plot that shook a nation to its core, leaving a lasting legacy of fear and grief in its wake. His trial was a public spectacle, and in the end, Dzhokhar was convicted of 30 charges, including the use of a weapon of mass destruction. He was sentenced to death, but the appeal process saw his fate remain uncertain for years. In 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death sentence, and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev remains behind bars in the Supermax prison in Colorado. His story serving as a chilling reminder of the darkness one individual fueled by radical ideology can unleash on the world. Each individual wore a mask of normalcy, while harboring a capacity for destruction that devastated families, communities, and entire cities. Their stories remind us that evil often moves unnoticed until it strikes. As we strive to protect society and uphold justice, one question remains. How do we recognize the warning signs before tragedy unfolds? And do we truly know the people we live among? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you have made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you will enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.